We go through reality, or we go through life thinking we recognize one kind of reality. And here are people coming forward with a completely different sense of reality. And they say that these things happened to them. And John could not poke holes in it. In other words, he knew it didn't sound normal. It didn't sound like something that occurs normally in our reality. And yet he could not find any flaw in their stories. In other words, he knew they were not making it up. They were, if anything, they weren't profiting by their experiences. They were suffering. Sure. And they were telling basically the same stories, versions of the same stories. He was really looking for a way to discredit the stories because he didn't believe them either. It's certainly not at first. But eventually, he said he found no explanation other than the ones the stories were true in some sense, as hard as it is to believe. He could not debunk them, unlike, the professional debunkers who claim they know everything and they say, oh, this has to be sleep apnea, or this has to be a nightmare. I mean, they're very quick, but they haven't read the research. They haven't studied the subject as I have, as John did. So these skeptics rate very low, in my opinion, because they haven't done the hard work to understand what the phenomenon is.
All right. We're here. We're back. We're back with Ralph Blumenthal. Ralph, for more than 45 years, led an extensive and illustrious career at the Times as Texas correspondent and Southwest Bureau, arts and culture news reporter, investigative crime reporter, foreign correspondent in West Germany, South Vietnam, Cambodia. It goes on. And I implore the reader to go to his website, by the way, that we'll announce in just a moment, and check out his bio. But in that bio, you'll also see that he's a distinguished lecturer at the Baruch College, the City University of New York. Also a journalism instructor at the Phillips Exeter Academy, award-winning reporter for New York Times. From 1964, he worked there 1964 to 2009, and has read probably thousands of books, but written 7 books on organized crime and cultural history. He led the Times Metro team that won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage in 1993 for the truck bombing of the World Trade Center. In 2001, he was named a fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation to research the progressive career and penal reforms of Warren Lewis E. Law's The Man Who Made Sing Sing Sing. During the pandemic, he contributed articles to the Times and other publications and gave virtual talks on his new book, and has been giving virtual talks on his new book, The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. And in 2023, just 2 years ago, he and his wife, Deborah, co-wrote a children's book, young adult fiction, published UFOs, UFOHS, Mysteries in the Sky, a nonfiction picture book for children. We're going to explore this and much more here in the next 45 minutes or so. You can check him out at ralphblumenthal.com as well. That's his personal website. And you go on YouTube and social media and you'll find more about what he is. But today we're going to find out more of what he is live, face to face. Ralph, welcome to the show.
Luciano, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I always appreciate talking to people from New York City because there's a hurriedness and there's a sense of urgency, like there's a hustle in people's energy. That's not short in you. So let's get to the point. To one of them at least. You were never interested in journalism when you were young. You were interested in art, and you went to an art school. Is that correct?
Yeah, right. I went to a high school for music and art. I wanted to be a sculptor or a painter, and then went to City College of New York, where I joined the student paper, and that was fate. I fell in love with journalism. I loved finding out about things before other people and being in that position of authority. It just pushed all my buttons, so I made the switch to journalism.
What was it that, at that point, art and a vocation in art did for you?
Well, I mean, I always loved art. I loved to draw. I loved to paint. Yeah, I mean, it just gave me an insight into the world of the arts, which is very important. I mean, art education is shortchanged in public school. It was then, I'm sure it still is today, but it gave me a wonderful appreciation for the arts that I still have today. I go to museums. I don't paint, draw, or do sculpture now, but I write. And I still have that appreciation for art. So that's something you never lose.
Well, let's fast forward to a question that perhaps I should ask you in half an hour. I'll ask it now. If you stopped writing, what would you be doing?
Oh boy, that's almost an impossible question to answer because I can't imagine not writing. I mean, I'd be reading. Reading is very important to every writer. I don't know of any great writer who wasn't a good reader. And I do spend a lot of time reading history, nonfiction and fiction. So I'd probably be doing a lot of reading. And I might go back to art. Who knows? But I love writing, and I keep on submitting articles to the New York Times and other publications. So it's hard to imagine anything else I'd rather be doing.
And where would you be if it's not New York?
Oh boy, again, that's a tough one because New York is my home. I've traveled widely, been to Canada, been to Europe, I've been to Asia, worked for the New York Times in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Germany. So I've traveled widely. I could be home in a lot of cities. I love a lot of foreign cities. We love Venice. I made a trip there recently. I love Paris, but New York is my home, and I guess I'm most comfortable there.
Speaking of Germany, just as a quick background, because I didn't know this about you until you and I chatted last time. You're of German descent. Your family came to the U.S. in the 1920s. So you grew up speaking German?
I did. My parents came to New York from Berlin in 1929, right in time for the Great Depression. And luckily they got out before the Nazis took over, a decade or less than a decade later. Hitler took over in, 1930, but 33. So they would have had to flee. My grandmother had to flee in 1934 and came to New York, and some of my relatives came late, and one didn't. My uncle died in the Holocaust. So my parents were very foresighted to come here in 1929, and I grew up in New York. And I was speaking German when I was young, and that helped me later in college because I could quickly add to my German facility. And then when I was posted to Germany for the New York Times, West Germany in those days, I picked up the language very quickly.
How did a career in the arts or a career in writing and journalism, how did that wash with your immigrant family? Was even an issue?
No, my parents were very generous. They weren't pushing me in any one particular direction. My father was in the dental business. He sold dental supplies to dentists, and I think he would have been happy if I would have gone into that business. But I made it clear early on I wasn't interested in business. I was interested first in the arts and then in journalism, and that they were fine with that. They encouraged me as long as I was happy. They were happy.
So we heard about you when we were in our discussions on the podcast with Leslie Kane, and then we were following some of your work since, or we have been following some of your work since, and listened to many of your interviews as well. And then we finally decided to reach out to you because we have been covering, and I say covering, like podcast wise, we haven't been writing like you have been and researching like you have, but we've been doing our slice of that with people who knew a fellow named John Mack. And your name kept popping up because you had spent quite a many year researching before you came out with a particular book. And I will give you the couple of names. You know them both for sure. Diana Pasalko is one of them because she mentioned him in one of her first books. And Rudy Shield, who was a friend of his at Harvard, and who both of them have been on the podcast several times. If you don't mind, for the listener, give us an indication on who you learned John Mack was when you first learned about him, and then why you decided to go down a rabbit hole learning more.
Well, all my books, and I'd written a number of them before I ever crossed paths with John Mack, sort of fell into my lap. I think there's something paranormal or Zen-like about how books find me, not the other way around. So every book I did grew out of some strange circumstance I had or ran across. So I was in Texas for the New York Times. I was the bureau chief in Houston, covering the Southwest, and I went into a used bookstore and I found a copy of this book by someone I'd never heard of, John Mack. It was his second book, it turned out, Passport to the Cosmos. And I looked at it. I mean, he was a Harvard psychiatrist of great renown. And he was writing about people with encounters who remembered encounters with alien beings. I thought that was kind of striking for a Harvard psychiatrist to be interested in, alien encounters. So I got interested in him, and I thought I'd interview him. He was already very famous, and I didn't realize that. I'd never heard of him, and I was going to call him up for an interview. I thought it's an unusual guy. And a few days later, I picked up the paper to find he'd been run over in London and killed. He had written a book on Lawrence of Arabia, a biography that won the Pulitzer Prize. And 30 years later, there was a gathering in London to celebrate, biographers of T.E. Lawrence. And Mac went, and he looked the wrong way, as Yanks do in London, and they got run over. Some people thought it was a conspiracy. It wasn't, I found out. He just looked the wrong way. So I couldn't interview him, but I did make contact with the family, which was deeply grieving at that point, and not in a position to talk about his life at all. But I persevered, and finally got them to agree to share their extensive archive of his papers, his therapy sessions, his personal observations, all his writings. And he was a great saver, it turned out. So I had this wonderful archive, and I got absolutely intrigued by, again, this guy who was a Harvard psychiatrist, grew up in a wealthy family, didn't need the money, but was captured, captivated himself by this whole phenomenon of, people who have memories or believe they have strong memories of encounters with alien beings. So I spent the next 17 years on and off researching the life of John Mack, and came out with my book in 2022 or 2021, I believe.
17 years on anything is a long time. Why? Why? What is it that drove you to stick with something 17 years long?
Yeah. Well, it was a labor of love, and it wasn't 17 years continuously. I did other things. I contributed articles to the New York Times, but it turned out there was a lot of material to go through. It was a very complicated story because he had many interests. He was an expert on childhood nightmares. He was a social activist. He demonstrated against nuclear weapons. He went to the Middle East to try to arrange peace, with Yasser Arafat. So he was a man of many different interests. He was really quite an extraordinary life. And when you have a tremendous archive that's given to you, handed over to you, you have a responsibility, if you're a writer trained as I was by the New York Times, to pursue facts. So I couldn't really get enough. I mean, I was just soaking up all this information, and writing, as you probably know, writing is rewriting. So you never just sit down and write a draft. It's always a draft and then another draft, and I revised it. So I spent a lot of time redoing the book. Went through a lot of processes, and interviewing people, all his friends, his family, etc. So that eats up time, and I was amazed too. 17 years later, I look back, I said, "My God, I put a lot of time into this book. I'd written 6 other books of nonfiction, but nothing like this. It took time like this."
What is it that you think that his family saw in you to give over all these intimate details and his works, and then wait as well for you to come up with something?
Well, first they saw my enthusiasm. They saw my professional, credentials. I'd written other books. I'd, been at the New York Times for 45 years. So, I was clearly a serious journalist. And I think they wanted to see that this was somebody who was eager to understand John Mack. I had an open mind. I was not a particularly, a UFO believer, as they say. I had no experiences of my own with UFOs, and neither did John Mack, by the way. He always felt bad that he never saw a UFO. He never had any interactions with alien beings. He did have an interesting psychological history because his mother died when he was 8 months old of an infection, and so he was always haunted by the fact that he never knew his mother, and he found ways of through hypnosis-like techniques of relaxing his mind and imagining his mother, and he felt he'd made contact with her in some way. So he was sort of in touch with sort of unusual properties of the human mind. But as I say, he'd never seen a spaceship. He'd never seen aliens. So I felt I was very much in the same boat. But I think the family saw that I was serious about it, and they were very helpful.
You described yourself and John Mack as two people who had never experienced these things, never really terribly interested in these things until you were. And I'll throw myself in that bucket, if we can call it a bucket. I was never really curious about it. I never really ridiculed it either. I was just like, I was indifferent to it for a long while until I realized that there were a lot of people who were really curious about asking questions about it. And, that's how we start to get to know Leslie Kane and Dana Pasolka and start to know John Mack's story. So like you, we start to become super curious about people who are asking curious questions that we had never thought to ask. So that's what I have. We have found in you. Does that characterize your feeling as well? Like you're curious about people who are curious about things?
Yeah, I mean, look,
does that awaken you in any way?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I came to this subject like a journalist. I mean, I had spent my career investigating the mafia and political corruption and, public figures. So I approach every possible story as a journalist. How much can I find out about this? What interests me? And what really captured me, as it captured John Mack, was the fact that people all over the world, men and women and all different walks of life, highly educated people, basically uneducated people, blue-collar people, and little children, were telling these stories that made no sense to us in this reality that we recognize, that they had encounters with these strange beings. They were beamed onto their spacecraft, subject to sort of pseudo-medical experiments. But these people insisted later that these were not nightmares. This was happening in a complete reality that they recognized as reality. And the stories were very consistent. They weren't, cookie cutter copies. They weren't telling the same story. It's not something they'd seen on TV or in the movies or read about, and they were just repeating. The stories had bizarre details that nobody could ever think about making up.
Right.
But everybody had a very, really gripping accounts. And John Mack, remember, was a psychiatrist, so he was used to probing people's memories, and he wasn't easily fooled. He was not, naive or gullible. A few times he went a little too far in his acceptance of stories, but basically he knew when people were faking it, and these people, he was convinced, were not faking it when they recounted their experiences under light hypnosis or relaxation techniques. They were completely distraught, and they were reliving these intensely traumatic encounters. And the fact that, as I said, they occurred to people from all different walks of life, all over the world, and in some cases, little children with saying, little man, take me up in the sky. These are kids who never read a book about UFOs. They never went to the movies.
Sure. Sure.
They just said what they said, and the parents were astounded. And by the way, often John Mack found that these experiences run in families. So parents who'd had encounters often found that their children were having encounters. So for some reason, it does seem to run in families. Anyway, so that's what gripped me as it gripped John Mack.
running in families, I don't want to let that go here, because we've spoken to a few people now who've been on a podcast. One of them is Gary Nolan. So on the biological side of things, maybe I'm misstating it by saying that, but on the biological side of things, also discussed the high propensity of running, those experiences running within family trees. Ray Hernandez, who's on the podcast a couple of times, and along with Rudy Shield, Edgar Mitchell, and Mary Rodwell, a compendium. There was a large study that lasted 5-6 years, like 4,000 respondents to this very long survey of 600 questions, and they found the same. Amongst many things, they found the same. And then, there was somebody else, and now it's Rudy Shield. Perfect, because I wanted to talk to you about Rudy Shield. Rudy Shield, we met, and I know you've interviewed him. You know him. He told us he was a colleague of John Mack's at Harvard. So Rudy Shield, for listeners who haven't listened to him yet on the podcast, we've had a few episodes. He was an astronomer and astrophysicist. And John Mack, his story is that John Mack phoned him up and said, "Hey, can we have a coffee? Because I'm finding that I'm doing some research and clinical work that seems to have, in his words, cosmological implications." So he explained that scenario was the scenario where he and John Mack started to bond, because Rudy Shield, like you, hadn't really given it any thought and maybe even poo-pooed it up until that point, but started to see the science, the research behind this kind of discovery, this exploration. So it caught him as well. He gave another story, and you tell me if you've heard something different or if you have something here, because this is and I don't remember, and I'm sharing this now because I don't remember whether we've put this on record or whether Rudy just told me. But he said at the day after John Mack won his case against Harvard, so for the listener, Harvard tried to kick him out of the university, and he fought and won the case with Danny Sheehan as his lawyer, also on the podcast. He called Rudy and said that he was either the dean or the president of Harvard. He said, "Rudy, I've been called to visit him at his office. I'm just letting you know this. I have no idea what's going to go down now." And Rudy said, "What happened made me. I was never more proud of Harvard University after I found out what happened at that meeting." And he said, at that meeting, whatever it was, the president or the dean told John, he says, you work at one of the most resourced universities on planet Earth. Use it at your discretion for your research. Anyway.
Yeah. John Mack was basically exonerated by Harvard. They put him through the ringer. They had a very high-level secret committee. It was an inquisition, really, to inquire into his beliefs, his finances, whether he was, using the scientific method. They were looking to see whether he was. Harvard was getting a lot of bad publicity from people who were, alumni reading about his research and thought it would be detrimental to Harvard. And in the end, they found that John Mack had done nothing wrong, and basically said, "You were a little too enthusiastic. You really have to curb your enthusiasm," which he did. He realized
you didn't want to say it, but you did.
He was.
Sorry, go ahead.
But as you mentioned, he had done nothing wrong, and I didn't hear that. I didn't know that story. But in the end, Harvard said you're free to pursue your research, which he did. Now, one story Rudy Shield did tell me is that when he was a neighbor, basically, of John's, and when they were talking together one day, Rudy said, "John, I have to be very careful. I can't be seen talking to you." He thought it would hurt. Rudy was joking that it would hurt his career as a physicist to be talking to John Mack, because John was a controversial figure. He went on a lot of TV shows. He went on Oprah. He went on a lot of other shows. He was not shy about talking about his research. He went on shows with experiencers, who were the people, the name he put on the abductees, because it was less judgmental. Whatever they experienced wasn't necessarily an abduction, perhaps scientifically, because no one knows it can't be reproduced. No one knows what a abduction is, except the people who experience it anyway. But John went on all these shows, and he was not shy about subjecting himself to criticism. It came with the territory. So in that sense, he was very brave.
I'll tack on something else to this. I did see, so I think I saw the Oprah one. I saw a man who was upper end of middle aged and very accomplished, very distinguished, very well read, very well spoken. I'm like, he's just like, he doesn't need to do this. He's already
Right.
built a career. He's built an expertise. I mean, that's what gets me. That's what really got me curious when I was watching some of his interviews. But there was one. I'm not sure if you've seen this. I have to look for it. And it was like a 20-minute talk that he gave in a small closed room. And I think Jacques Vallée was in this room because I recognized the back of his head and he had asked the question. But John Mack mentioned two words that I had never heard before together. And he was speaking about confronting people's hardened belief systems, unmovable belief systems.
Right.
And belief systems that won't allow for the absorption of new material. And he called it ontological, the meeting out of it, he called it ontological totalitarianism.
The phrase he's often identified with is ontological shock, because it strikes at the basis of our belief system. We go through reality, we go through life thinking we recognize one kind of reality, and here are people coming forward with a completely different sense of reality, and they say that these things happened to them, and John could not poke holes in it. In other words, he knew it didn't sound normal. It didn't sound like something that occurs normally in our reality, and yet he could not find any flaw in their stories. In other words, he knew they were not making it up. They were, if anything, they weren't profiting by their experiences. They were suffering. Sure. And they were telling basically the same stories, versions of the same stories. He was really looking for a way to discredit the stories because he didn't believe them either. It's certainly not at first. But eventually he said he found no explanation other than the ones the stories were true in some sense, as hard as it is to believe. He could not debunk them, unlike, the professional debunkers who claim they know everything and they say, oh, this has to be sleep apnea or this has to be a nightmare. I mean, they're very quick, but they haven't read the research. They haven't studied the subject as I have, as John did. So these skeptics rate very low, in my opinion, because they haven't done the hard work to understand what the phenomenon is.
In your work about John Mack, would you call that your hard work to understand?
Well, I mean, I had to understand him and interpret him. He wrote his own books. He didn't need me. So he wrote, Encounters with Aliens was his first book, and Human Encounters with Aliens. And his second book was Passport to the Cosmos. And he wrote some other books about nightmares and dreams and things like that. But what I brought to the table, you could say, was that I was an independent journalist with no background in, ufology. And I was looking at his life and trying to understand what it was that made him such a compelling figure. So, I'm humble about it. I mean, I didn't do the work he did.
Right.
And I'm not a professional the way, he was a professional psychiatrist with a lot of credentials and a very lofty position at Harvard. But at least I had the benefit of his research, and I could subject his research to, my journalistic tests. And as I said, he comes across as a genuine, likable, genuine person who was, by the way, not a perfect person. He had, problems too. He was unfaithful to his wife, who was long suffering and loved him and put up with a lot. He had a lot of traumas through the early death of his mother, as I mentioned. He was haunted by that. He had his own struggles. But, what I think I brought to the table was an ability to use his material and find an independent vantage point to judge him.
What about your belief systems? Were they touched? Were they revised? Did you have a hard look inside for what you believe while you were doing this work?
Well, I always regarded myself as a pretty spiritual person. I was brought up Orthodox Jewish. And my grandmother was very religious, and we went to an Orthodox temple. And
Hmm.
so I was brought up in traditional Orthodox Judaism. I didn't, have a clear sense of, the paranormal. I was not a aficionado of, ghost stories or anything like that. Basically, I was a journalist, so I came to everything, as a skeptic. Um, but the more I learned from John Mack's story, the more questions I had, and the more I realized that there's a lot of things in this world that we don't understand, not just because the physics is beyond us, but because they bring to they bring up a lot of experiences that we just have no way of assessing. The survival of consciousness stories of people who are pronounced clinically dead and yet come back and remember things that their mind experienced when they were supposedly clinically dead. So that, there are just a lot of things that it opened up my horizons. Reading about John Mack and studying John Mack and talking, and I talked to a lot of experiences myself,
Hmm.
people who talked to him and people who came along after he died with their own experiences. It's happening today. I mean, there's still people today who come forward and tell me of experiences they've had, and they are very, very hard to categorize.
Do you think the belief in this does it contradict your spiritualism or beliefs through your
No, not
religion?
at all. Because if you are a traditional believer in religion, there are a lot of mysteries there, both
Hmm.
in Catholicism, Judaism, Islam. I mean, all the organized religions have some mystery at its core. So it's not By the way, the Vatican was a big proponent of ufology. I mean, they were studying. There were priests there in the Vatican, astronomy departments who are studying these encounters themselves, because you can't be in the religion business, and talk about miraculous experiences of Jesus or Moses, and not have your mind open to other
Hmm.
mysteries. And
Ah,
basically, it's just mysteries. It's
well said.
mysteries. And, you know, the point I make in the book I did with my wife, the UFO nonfiction book for children, is that it's a mystery. We don't know the answers. But we know now, thanks to the governments being more forthcoming, that these objects are real. The objects exist. They're not hallucinations. They're not nightmares. They're
Hmm.
not made up. They're not all reflections of headlights off the desert floor.
Yeah.
Some of them are. Some of them are planes and birds. We know that. Not all UFO reports are of UFOs. They can be explained, some of them, but some of them can't, and especially the ones that are more interesting and more detailed. And now the government, thanks to its videos that we put out in the New York Times and and other uh, journalists have brought forth, the government has said basically now, well, there are objects there that we don't know where they come from. We don't know, how they move in ways that we don't understand, and they're in the water too. By the way, they're seen coming in and out of the water, which is hard to imagine, not just the atmosphere. So these are legitimate mysteries, and they can't be quickly explained, not by the skeptics, you know. So there you are. I mean, it just needs more work.
In a sense, your work, especially your work in that New York Times article in 2017, in a sense, you kind of vindicated some of John Mack's work. I don't know. It's my thoughts.
Well, it's nice to think that. I mean, interestingly enough, I was already working on the John Mack book when Leslie Kane came to me one day and said she'd been at a meeting in Washington with some high-level people, including Pentagon people, and she came back and said she had learned that the Pentagon had a secret office to investigate UFOs, which it said. I mean, supposedly the Pentagon was out of the UFO business with the end of Project Blue Book in 1970. That was the last official investigation of UFOs, and the Pentagon took the official position that, well, there's nothing to see here, folks. It's, everything can be explained. There's no mystery. But again, secretly, they were continuing to investigate UFOs, and there was an ongoing office that Leslie found out about at this meeting in Washington, and the head of it, Lou Elizondo, was quitting because he was getting so much internal opposition for his research. So that was the story that she came to me with, and I took to the New York Times. I still had contacts there, and that they gave us the green light to investigate and write up, and we put it on they put it on the front page one day in December 2017, and it was a sensation because the mainstream media had not until that time been paying much attention to UFO reports, especially not that the government was still in the UFO business. So it did cause quite an effect, and then we did some other stories after that.
Let me go back to, you mentioned your wife, and we did as well in the reading of your bio at the beginning, that you co-wrote a book called UFOs, UFOHS, nonfiction for kids. Why? Why'd you do that?
Well, Debbie, my wife, who's a children's book writer, she'd written about 25 books of her own on children's books and some adult fiction and nonfiction. And she heard me doing all these interviews for the John Mack book. And she said, well, why don't we do a book for children? Because children need to have some way of grappling with this subject too. They see so much on TV and the movies, they don't know what to believe. And they go to their parents, and the parents don't know what to tell them, and teachers and librarians. So we decided to write a book just based on the science, what we know so far. We got a very good illustrator who had illustrated another one of Debbie's books, Adam Gustafson, and he did wonderful drawings and paintings of people seeing UFOs, and starts off with a real story about a kid I had interviewed in the John Mack book. He was a kid then who saw a UFO on the tennis court when he was growing up, and so we put that story in there. And basically, we said these are things people have seen. These are things that exist. In other words, they're physically real, but no one knows anything about them. And we don't talk about aliens, and we don't do any speculation. We just say these are objects that people have seen for a long time. The story that one crashed at Roswell is a legitimate mystery. The government claimed later that it was a weather balloon or something. It doesn't hold water, that explanation. It's a genuine mystery. So we compiled all this and told kids, what is known, what is not known, and that it's an interesting subject. So we've gotten some nice attention with that book. We've sold it at book fairs. We have kids coming over all the time, interested. So we're very proud of that book.
Just to give a quick background to have the listener understand where she was coming from, you said she was she's a nutritionist, wrote for the New York Times as a beauty and health columnist. And as you mentioned, saw you in your work, and she became interested because of that. But you used 4 words, or 5 words, which I found curious. Simple words, like nothing words. But for me, it was something. You said, because of that, her sensibility had been raised. That connoted for me like an openness. Like she was just open.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
Everyone who comes to this subject is hooked. So many people like me who came to it really with no preconceived ideas. We weren't really paying much attention. But the more we read about it, the more we read about it, the more people today hear about it, the more intrigued they become. Here is a genuine mystery, and there's a number of mysteries that will stay with us. How did the universe begin? What was the Big Bang? What happened before the Big Bang? Where do we go after we die? All these questions that seem to have no answers. What are these objects? Where do they come from? Why are they here? who's running them, if they're human beings or beings of some kind or another behind the wheel. Are they robotic? All these questions, which are nice to know that we haven't run out of mysteries in this day and age when we're so scientifically oriented.
So I'm with you. And I would say, I mean, that's the frustration. That's the frustration with a mystery as well as the excitement of a mystery. You want the answer.
You get very impatient.
More questions you ask.
What's the answer? What's the answer? Let's cut to the chase. What's the bottom line? And we don't know the bottom line. We may not know.
That's a New York impatient.
For a long time, if ever. But I think we will. We're getting some answers. At least we know now, thanks to the government, that these things are real, that they're not, figments of the imagination. They're not mythology. They're not hallucinations. They're not reflections. Some are. I mean, some are. Not everything reported as a UFO is a UFO. That's a good point to make, that there are many of these objects that turn out to have a natural explanation, but some defy that categorization and cannot be explained.
What question, if there were one question that you could ask that you would get the answer to before you die, what would that question be?
Oh, boy. Well, I mentioned a couple. One is what came before the Big Bang?
You can't cheat.
Words,
it's got to be one.
Okay, well, I would say even more pressing as I get older is what happens after we die. And, again, these experiences that people have had who were pronounced clinically dead, they later remembered things that they could not or should not have been able to remember when they were clinically dead. And doctors were amazed. They said, you were flatlined, and yet now you remember, you saw your body floating up in the operating room. You looked down at the doctors. You could recall their conversations. You heard how did you know what the nurses were saying to the doctors? And these people recount that. So there is a deep, deep, persistent, human mystery as to what happens after we die. Does consciousness survive, at any point in some way? That to me, that's the number one question.
Okay, last question. What is greatness to you?
Oh boy, greatness. Well, greatness is an ability to, I guess, transcend, the normal, and it's made up. It's hard to define because we know it when we see it, and we strive towards it. Many of us, without achieving it, and only later, is it, can we decide? Well, this person was great. It's mixture of courage and faith and ability to persist, as John Mack did. It takes many forms, but we know it when we see it.
Oh, nice. We know it when we see it. Well, I would interpret that as a knowing that we're all very similar to begin with, if we can know it when we see it. Ralph, thank you for your time. I really appreciate your New York energy. It's been a while since we had that in the show.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
Thank you, Luciano. Pleasure to be with you, and we'll follow up another time. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ralph.